The millionaire's son married the humble maid to defy his father. However, when he found his son, he was paralyzed by what he saw. Ethan Parker sat in the grand dining room of the Parker mansion, the heavy crystal chandelier casting an opulent glow over the polished mahogany table. Across from him, his father, Richard Parker, read the morning paper, barely acknowledging Ethan's presence. This was a routine Ethan had grown all too familiar with: stiff conversations, empty pleasantries, and the suffocating sense of duty that filled every corner of his life. "Don't forget about the gala tonight," Richard said, his voice stern without ever looking up. "It's important you make an appearance. The Morgans will be there, and I expect you to be on your best behavior." Ethan nodded, but inside, a wave of frustration swelled. The Morgans. The family his father had long decided Ethan would marry into, forging yet another business alliance. For as long as Ethan could remember, his future had been mapped out for him: run the family business, marry into the right family, and maintain the Parker legacy. Yet none of it felt like his own life. None of it felt real. After a few more minutes of silence, Ethan excused himself from the table. As he walked through the corridors of the mansion, the grandeur that surrounded him only added to his sense of entrapment. Marble floors, gilded mirrors, and priceless artwork. It all felt like a prison disguised as luxury. Passing through the kitchen, Ethan saw Emily Davis, the young woman hired as a housekeeper, cleaning the counters. She worked diligently, her movements quick and precise, but there was a softness to her demeanor, something that stood in stark contrast to the cold, calculated world Ethan had grown up in. Their eyes met briefly. She gave him a polite nod, but there was something in her expression, a quiet understanding that made Ethan pause. He had noticed her before, of course. She was different from the others who worked in the house. Her kindness seemed genuine, not the forced politeness he was used to from those who served his family. Ethan lingered a moment longer than necessary, something stirring in him that he couldn't quite place. Emily quickly returned to her task, but that brief moment stuck with him as he left the kitchen. It was a fleeting interaction, but it was enough to remind him of how hollow everything else felt. Later that evening, Ethan stood in front of the large mirror in his bedroom, adjusting his tie for the gala. The reflection staring back at him looked perfect, impeccably dressed, every hair in place, but it didn't feel like him. Not really. He was simply playing the role his father had written for him. The sound of laughter drifted up from the party already in full swing downstairs, but it did nothing to lift his spirits. He was expected to entertain, to impress the Morgans, and to make sure his father's carefully laid plans unfolded as intended. But all Ethan could think about was how desperately he wanted to escape it all. Downstairs, the ballroom was filled with New York's elite. Champagne flowed freely, and conversation buzzed as the rich and powerful mingled. Ethan moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries, but his heart wasn't in it. When he finally saw the Morgans, more specifically, their daughter, Charlotte, the woman his father had been pushing him toward, he felt a knot tighten in his chest. Charlotte was beautiful, poised, and everything his father would want in a daughter-in-law. But to Ethan, she was nothing more than a symbol of everything he didn't want. As the night dragged on, Ethan found himself retreating to the quieter corners of the mansion. He slipped into the library, grateful for a moment of solitude. The walls were lined with leather-bound books, a fire crackling softly in the hearth. But even here, the weight of his father's expectations pressed down on him. His mind drifted back to Emily. He barely knew her, yet something about her presence had been a balm to the growing restlessness inside him. She was everything his world wasn't: genuine, unpretentious, free in a way he longed to be. Just as Ethan was lost in thought, a knock sounded at the door, and Richard entered, his expression unreadable. "You're avoiding Charlotte," Richard said flatly. Ethan sighed, the tension between them palpable. "I'm not avoiding anyone. I just needed a moment." Richard crossed the room, his presence as imposing as ever. "You know what's expected of you, Ethan. The Morgans are a valuable alliance. I've built everything for you. Don't throw it away because of some childish rebellion." Ethan clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to snap back. His father would never understand. Richard saw the world in terms of power, money, and control. Ethan wanted something more, something real. "I'm not interested in living the life you've planned for me," Ethan finally said, his voice firm despite the storm brewing inside him. Richard's eyes narrowed. "You'll do what's right for this family." With that, he turned and left, leaving Ethan standing alone in the vast, empty room. As the door clicked shut, Ethan felt the weight of his father's words settle over him, but at the same time, a spark of defiance flickered within him. He couldn't live this life. Not anymore. And maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. The morning after the gala, Ethan woke with the same sense of restlessness he had felt the night before. His father's words echoed in his mind, but his resolve remained firm. He couldn't continue living a life dictated by Richard, and the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that he needed a way out, something or someone to hold on to. As the sun poured through the large windows of his bedroom, Ethan made his way downstairs, heading for the garage. Driving often cleared his head, and he was determined to spend the morning on the open road, away from the expectations of the mansion. However, as he passed through the kitchen, he caught sight of Emily again. She was alone this time, carefully stacking dishes in the drying rack. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then walked toward her, his heart beating a little faster than usual. There was something about her, something grounding, something real. In a world full of pretenses and hollow social exchanges, Emily was refreshingly genuine. "Good morning," Ethan said, his voice softer than usual. Emily glanced up, a little surprised to see him. "Morning, Mr. Parker," she replied politely, a hint of a smile on her face. "You can call me Ethan," he said, leaning against the counter. "How's everything going?" Emily looked a little uncertain at first, but she wiped her hands on a towel and shrugged lightly. "Just the usual, cleaning up after everyone's big night." He nodded, glancing around the kitchen. "It must be exhausting, dealing with all of this." "It can be," she admitted, her voice quiet but honest. "But it's a job. And, well, I'm grateful for it." Ethan's brow furrowed. Grateful. It was hard for him to comprehend being grateful for working in a place like this, where you were constantly reminded of your lower status. "You're happy working here?" he asked, genuinely curious. Emily paused, thinking for a moment. "It's not about being happy with the job. It's about knowing I'm doing something for my family, helping them. I guess that's what keeps me going." Her words struck Ethan deeply. She was doing this for her family, working hard to provide for them, while his own family had only ever made him feel trapped. The contrast was glaring. "You're a lot stronger than I am," he said with a slight chuckle, though there was a seriousness behind his words. Emily tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated, glancing toward the door to make sure no one was listening. Then, he let out a breath. "I feel like I've been living someone else's life for as long as I can remember. My father, he controls everything. My job, my relationships, even where I'm supposed to be going in life. It's suffocating." Emily's eyes softened. She could see the burden in his expression, the weight he carried on his shoulders despite the privilege he was born into. "That sounds tough," she said softly. "I guess money doesn't always mean freedom." He looked at her, surprised by how simply and perfectly she had captured the essence of his struggles. "No, it doesn't," he said quietly. "Not in my case, at least." A silence settled between them. Not awkward, but filled with an understanding neither had expected. Emily turned back to the dishes, her hands moving as if on autopilot. "Why don't you do something about it?" she asked after a moment, her tone casual but with a hint of curiosity. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "What can I do? I'm tied to this family. If I walk away, I lose everything." Emily glanced over her shoulder, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze. Maybe losing everything isn't the worst thing. Her words lingered in the air, echoing through Ethan's mind long after she had spoken them. Maybe losing everything wasn't the worst thing. The thought had crossed his mind before, but hearing it from Emily gave it weight, gave it substance. Could he really walk away from the wealth, the name, the life that had been so carefully curated for him? Before he could respond, footsteps echoed down the hall, and Emily quickly returned to her task, her face becoming neutral again. One of the other housekeepers entered, greeting them both before bustling around the kitchen. Ethan gave Emily a small nod and left, but the conversation replayed in his head all day. Later that evening, as he sat in his study, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was right. He had spent his entire life clinging to the privileges his family name afforded him, but in doing so, he had lost sight of who he truly was. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that perhaps the only way to find freedom was to let go of the things that had been holding him back. For the next few days, Ethan found himself seeking out small moments with Emily, short conversations when no one else was around. They grew closer, though their interactions were always cautious, always under the radar. There was something unspoken between them, a mutual understanding that neither could put into words yet. One evening, as Ethan was helping her carry some linens to the upstairs wing, they paused on the stairway landing, out of sight of anyone else. The air between them was charged with something unspoken, something more than just a casual conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said," Ethan murmured, glancing down at her. "About losing everything. And maybe you're right. Maybe it's worth it." Emily looked up at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Sometimes freedom is worth the risk." And with those words, something shifted between them, a decision unspoken, but understood. The subtle, stolen moments between Ethan and Emily couldn't last forever. As much as they tried to keep things discreet, the tension in the Parker household was palpable. Ethan's growing detachment from his responsibilities and the way his eyes would linger on Emily didn't go unnoticed. In a world as tightly controlled as the one Richard Parker had built, secrets were hard to keep. It wasn't long before Richard caught wind of the situation. A housekeeper, eager to curry favor with her powerful employer, whispered into Richard's ear one morning over breakfast. "Mr. Parker, I've noticed something, unusual about your son's behavior lately," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. Richard barely looked up from his newspaper, uninterested in trivial gossip, but the housekeeper pressed on. "It's the way he spends time with the girl, Emily, the maid. They've been talking more. I just thought you should know." Richard's paper rustled as he set it down, his gaze hardening. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who was used to being in control. The housekeeper hesitated for a moment but then leaned in closer. "I think there's something going on between them. It's not proper for someone of Ethan's standing." For a brief moment, Richard sat in silence, processing the information. He had always been acutely aware of Ethan's growing dissatisfaction with his life. The tension between them had been building for years, but this was a different kind of betrayal. His son, involved with a maid, it was beneath the Parker name. Unacceptable. Without a word, Richard dismissed the housekeeper and left the dining room, his mind racing. He had to put a stop to this before it went any further. That evening, as Ethan sat in his study, trying to lose himself in a book, the door swung open without warning. Richard entered, his face a storm of barely restrained fury. "Is it true?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "Are you involved with that girl?" Ethan looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. He closed the book and leaned back in his chair, a wave of dread washing over him. He knew this confrontation was inevitable, but it didn't make it any easier to face. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ethan said, though the lie was weak and unconvincing. Richard stepped forward, his presence looming over the room. "Don't lie to me, Ethan. I know you've been spending time with that maid, Emily. Do you have any idea what this could do to our family's reputation?" Ethan's jaw tightened. He had spent his entire life worrying about the Parker name, about the legacy his father so desperately wanted him to protect. But now, standing at the edge of a precipice, Ethan felt something shift inside him. For once, he didn't care about the Parker name. For once, he cared about himself. "I'm not ashamed of her," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Emily isn't just some maid. She's kind, she's strong, and she actually listens to me, which is more than I can say for anyone in this house." Richard's eyes blazed with anger. "She's beneath you, Ethan. She's nothing. Do you really think you can throw away everything I've built for you, for some girl who cleans floors?" Ethan stood up, facing his father head on. "I'm not throwing anything away. You never gave me a choice. My whole life has been about what you want, what you've planned. I've never had a say in anything." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the weight of years of unspoken conflict hanging between them. Richard's fists clenched at his sides, his control slipping. "You will end this," Richard said coldly. "You will stop seeing her, or I will make sure she is fired. Do you understand me?" Ethan felt his heart drop. The threat hit him hard, but it was also expected. Richard had always been willing to use his power to get what he wanted, and Emily was just another pawn in his game. "No," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "You can't control this, Dad. You don't get to decide who I care about." Richard's eyes narrowed, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. "I have control over everything, Ethan. If you don't end this, I'll send her away. She'll never work in this town again." The words hung in the air like a noose tightening around Ethan's neck. He could feel the walls closing in, the impossible choice forming in front of him. Give in to his father and lose the only real connection he'd ever felt, or stand his ground and risk losing Emily forever. "I won't let you do that," Ethan said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You can take everything from me, but I won't let you ruin her life." Richard's face darkened. "You're going to regret this, son." With that, Richard stormed out of the study, leaving Ethan standing there, his heart pounding. For a few moments, Ethan couldn't move. The weight of his father's threats bore down on him, suffocating. But then, slowly, resolve began to harden in his chest. If Richard was going to make good on his threat, Ethan had no choice. He had to leave, and he had to take Emily with him. Ethan's decision had been made. There was no turning back now. The cold realization that he had to leave everything behind settled heavily on his shoulders, but at the same time, a strange sense of clarity washed over him. He couldn't let his father control his life anymore. More importantly, he couldn't let Richard destroy Emily's future. The next day, Ethan spent hours pacing his room, planning his escape. He knew his father's influence ran deep. He'd need to be smart, careful. A simple walk out the front door wouldn't suffice. Richard would come after him, no doubt. He always got what he wanted, and losing his only son to what he viewed as a reckless rebellion wasn't part of his plans. As evening fell, Ethan made his way downstairs, his heart hammering in his chest. He needed to talk to Emily, to tell her everything and prepare her for what was coming. He found her in the back garden, quietly tending to the flower beds, her hands moving gently over the petals. "Emily," he called softly, stepping out of the shadows and into the fading light of dusk. She looked up, surprised to see him there, and immediately sensed the urgency in his tone. "What's going on?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Ethan glanced around, making sure no one was nearby. "We need to leave. Tonight." Emily's brow furrowed, confusion and concern flashing across her face. "What do you mean? What happened?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "My father knows about us. He threatened to fire you, to ruin your life if I don't end things. He's not going to stop, Emily. He's going to make sure we can't be together unless we get out of here." Emily blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. "Leave? Ethan, where would we go? How would we even... We'll figure it out, Ethan interrupted, his voice firm but filled with an intensity she hadn't seen before. I don't care about the money, or the business, or any of it. I just want to be with you. We'll go somewhere far away from here, anywhere Richard can't reach us. Emily looked at him, her heart racing. This wasn't something she had ever expected. Ethan, the heir to the Parker empire, willing to give up everything for her. It seemed impossible, like something out of a story. Yet the sincerity in his eyes told her this was real. Are you sure about this? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I don't want you to regret anything. Ethan took her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Emily hesitated for only a moment longer before nodding. She trusted him. And more than that, she felt the same desperation to escape the suffocating world they both lived in. The thought of losing Ethan, of being forced to leave and never see him again, was more than she could bear. What do we do? She asked, her voice steadier now, determination taking root. We pack what we can, only what we need, Ethan said quickly. We'll leave tonight. I've got enough cash stashed away to get us started somewhere new. I know a small town upstate, Burlington, Vermont. No one will find us there. Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing. It was a bold plan, risky in every way. But what choice did they have? She gave him a small nod. Okay, let's do it. The next few hours passed in a blur of quiet preparation. Ethan gathered what little he could carry, stuffing clothes and personal items into a duffel bag. Emily packed her own belongings quickly, keeping everything simple and discreet. The household was still busy with the normal evening routine, none of the staff aware of what was happening. As midnight approached, the mansion grew quieter. The only sounds were the occasional footsteps of the night staff and the hum of distant cars on the street. Ethan and Emily slipped out through the back entrance, their hearts pounding as they moved through the shadows. The cool night air hit their faces as they made their way to Ethan's car, parked just outside the estate. Ethan loaded their bags into the trunk, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation. Emily stood beside him, her eyes scanning the empty streets, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. Are you ready? Ethan asked, turning to face her. Emily looked up at him, her expression a mix of fear and excitement. I am. With that, they climbed into the car, the weight of their decision settling heavily over them. Ethan started the engine, the low rumble breaking the silence of the night. He took one last look at the mansion, the place that had been his home for so long, but also his prison. Without another word, he pressed the gas pedal, and the car sped away from the estate. The city lights faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the dark, open road ahead. As they drove through the night, neither of them spoke much, the tension thick in the air. The reality of what they had just done, what they had left behind, was sinking in. But there was also a sense of freedom, a strange exhilaration that came from knowing they were finally in control of their own lives. After several hours of driving, the first signs of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a pale light across the road. Burlington was still a few hours away, but Ethan felt lighter with every mile they put between them and his father. He glanced over at Emily, who had fallen asleep in the passenger seat, her face soft and peaceful. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt free. The small town of Burlington greeted them with the soft glow of early morning light. Ethan slowed the car as they entered the quiet streets, lined with quaint houses and storefronts. It was a far cry from the towering skyscrapers and bustling noise of New York City, but that was exactly what Ethan and Emily needed: anonymity, peace, and a fresh start. They found a modest motel on the outskirts of town, where the roads were quieter and the pace of life seemed slower. As they checked in, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of calm settle over him. The town was different. No one recognized him. No one cared who he was or where he came from. For the first time in his life, he felt like just another person, free from the heavy burden of the Parker name. Their motel room was small, with dated furniture and creaky floors, but it was enough for now. Emily set down her bag and looked out the window, taking in the view of the rolling hills in the distance. A faint smile crossed her face. "It's beautiful here," she said quietly, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan walked over, standing beside her as they both looked out at the landscape. "Yeah," he agreed, his arm sliding around her waist. "It is." For the next few days, they settled into a new routine. Ethan found a small auto repair shop that was hiring, and despite his lack of experience, he convinced the owner to give him a chance. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and Ethan welcomed the chance to do something with his hands, something that didn't involve sitting in boardrooms or attending galas. Emily, meanwhile, found work at a local bakery. It was a cozy little place on the main street, filled with the comforting smells of fresh bread and pastries. She spent her days kneading dough and chatting with the regular customers, many of whom were kind and welcoming. The simplicity of it all brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, after a long day of work, Ethan returned to their small motel room, his clothes stained with grease and his hands sore from turning wrenches all day. Emily was already there, sitting on the bed with a warm cup of tea in her hands. She looked up as he entered, and a smile spread across her face. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice soft and inviting. "Tiring," Ethan admitted, collapsing onto the bed beside her. "But good. It feels real, you know? Like I'm actually doing something." Emily nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "I feel the same way. It's not easy, but it's ours." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them appreciating the simplicity of their new life. The stress and pressure of New York seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by the quiet contentment of Burlington. But even as they settled into their new routine, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this peace wouldn't last forever. His father had resources, power, and a relentless determination to control everything in his life. How long would it be before Richard found them? How long before he came to drag Ethan back into the world he had fought so hard to escape? One night, as they lay in bed, Emily sensed his unease. She turned to him, her hand resting gently on his chest. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" she asked softly. Ethan sighed, staring up at the ceiling. "Yeah, I know he's going to come after us eventually. It's only a matter of time." Emily was quiet for a moment, then spoke in a steady voice. "We'll deal with it when it happens. But for now, we have each other. That's what matters." Her words were like a balm to his troubled thoughts. She was right. They had each other, and that was enough. For now. Days turned into weeks, and before long, Burlington started to feel like home. They moved out of the motel and rented a small house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a little 2-bedroom with creaky floors and a leaky faucet, but it was theirs. Every piece of furniture they brought into the house, every dish they washed, every laugh they shared in that space made it feel more like home. Ethan's work at the garage became more rewarding with time. The shop owner, Mike, was a gruff but fair man who appreciated hard work. Though Ethan was still learning, he found satisfaction in the labor, the smell of engine oil, and the rhythm of the machines. It was a world far removed from the polished halls of his father's corporate empire. But it felt right. Emily thrived at the bakery, her gentle nature and warm smile quickly endearing her to the local customers. She formed friendships with her coworkers and found joy in the simplicity of baking bread and pastries. The work was exhausting, but it was honest. And every night, she came home to Ethan, tired but happy. On weekends, they explored the countryside, walking along the quiet trails that wound through the rolling hills. They talked about their future, about the possibility of building a life together far away from the shadow of Richard Parker. There was even talk of starting a family someday, though the idea was still distant, something they'd allow themselves to dream about in the safety of their new life. For the first time, it seemed like they had carved out a little corner of the world that was truly their own. But even as they found happiness in Burlington, the looming shadow of Richard's inevitable pursuit hung over them. And deep down, Ethan knew that this fragile peace could shatter at any moment. It had been months since Ethan and Emily had fled New York, and for a time, it seemed as though they had managed to outrun the inevitable. Burlington had become their sanctuary, a small town where no one asked questions, and their past didn't seem to matter. But deep down, Ethan had always known that his father would eventually find them. Richard Parker was not a man to be defied lightly. One late afternoon, as Ethan was finishing up at the garage, wiping the grease from his hands, the familiar sound of a car engine idling nearby caught his attention. He glanced up and immediately felt his heart drop into his stomach. A sleek black car, far too out of place in the humble town of Burlington, sat parked across the street. And stepping out of it, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, was Richard Parker. Ethan froze, his mind racing. It wasn't supposed to happen this soon. He had hoped for more time, for Richard to give up the search, but now the inevitable was standing right in front of him. Ethan, Mike, the garage owner, called out from across the shop. "You got a visitor or something?" Ethan blinked, shaking himself out of his shock. Yeah," he muttered, his voice unsteady. "I'll handle it." Mike gave him a curious look but didn't press further, busying himself with the engine he was working on. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and stepped outside, his heart pounding as he crossed the street to meet his father. Richard stood by the car, his expression unreadable. But there was a coldness in his eyes that Ethan had seen too many times before. His presence was a stark contrast to the quiet, unassuming streets of Burlington. This was a man who belonged in boardrooms and penthouses, not in small towns. "Ethan," Richard said, his voice low but firm, as though they were simply picking up a conversation that had never ended. "I've been looking for you." Ethan swallowed hard, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. The last thing he needed was for anyone in town to get involved in this. "How did you find me?" he asked, though he knew the answer before the words left his mouth. Richard had resources. There was no hiding from him forever. "I told you before, you can't just walk away from this family," Richard continued, ignoring the question. "From your responsibilities." Ethan clenched his fists at his sides, the weight of his father's expectations crashing down on him all over again. "I'm not coming back, Dad," he said, his voice steady despite the anxiety swirling in his chest. "I've started a new life here. I'm happy." Richard's lips tightened, his expression growing colder. "With her?" he asked, the disdain in his voice evident. "That girl? You think running off with some maid and playing mechanic in a small town is what you're meant to do?" Ethan felt his anger flare. "Yes, with her. And it's not playing mechanic, and it's real work, something you'd never understand. For once in my life, I'm living on my own terms." Richard took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This is not who you are, Ethan. You're a Parker. You don't get to run away and pretend you're someone else." "I'm not pretending," Ethan shot back, his voice rising. "I'm finally being myself. I'm not your puppet anymore, Dad. I don't care about the business, the money, or your stupid legacy. I have a life here, a real life with someone I love." The word love seemed to hang in the air between them, cutting through the tension like a knife. For a moment, Richard's expression faltered, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. "Love?" Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "You think love will keep you afloat when the world comes crashing down on you? You're deluding yourself, son. This little fantasy of yours won't last. And when it falls apart, you'll come crawling back to me." Ethan stared at his father, a mixture of anger and sadness twisting inside him. He had spent his whole life trying to live up to Richard's impossible standards, trying to be the son his father wanted. But now, standing face to face with him, Ethan realized how little they truly understood each other. "I won't," Ethan said quietly, his voice resolute. "I'm never coming back." Richard's eyes hardened, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable, as though years of unspoken resentment and frustration had finally reached a breaking point. Richard was the first to break the silence. "Is that your final decision?" he asked, his tone icy. Ethan nodded, his heart hammering in his chest. "Yes, it is." Richard took a step back, his face unreadable. "Fine," he said, his voice quiet but deadly. "But understand this, Ethan. You're turning your back on everything, your family, your legacy, your future. Don't think for a second that I'll be there to catch you when you fall." Without waiting for a response, Richard turned on his heel and walked back to the car. Ethan stood frozen, watching as his father got in and drove away, the sleek black vehicle disappearing down the street. The moment felt surreal, as though Ethan had just severed the last tie to his old life. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty road, the weight of the confrontation settling heavily on his shoulders. But for all the fear and uncertainty that came with facing his father, there was also a strange sense of relief. He had stood his ground. He had made his choice. Now, there was no going back. When Ethan returned home that evening, the weight of the confrontation with his father still clung to him like a heavy fog. He entered the small house, closing the door quietly behind him. The soft glow of the kitchen light illuminated the cozy space, where Emily was at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. The comforting smell of fresh herbs and broth filled the air, but tonight, Ethan barely noticed. Emily looked up from her cooking, her smile fading when she saw the expression on his face. "Ethan, what happened?" Ethan set down his keys, running a hand through his hair. "He found us," he said simply, the words heavy in the quiet room. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had known this day would come, had prepared herself for it in the back of her mind, but hearing it out loud still sent a shiver down her spine. She set the spoon down and moved toward him, her eyes searching his face. "Your father?" Ethan nodded, sinking into a chair at the small kitchen table. "He showed up at the garage today, told me everything I already knew, that I'm throwing away my life, that I'll regret this. The usual." His voice was flat, but underneath, Emily could hear the tension, the conflict. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her hand resting gently on his. "What did you say?" Ethan sighed, staring at the wooden surface of the table as if it held all the answers. "I told him I'm not coming back, that this is my life now, and I'm not going to let him control me anymore." Emily's hand tightened around his. "And how did he take that?" A bitter chuckle escaped Ethan's lips. "He wasn't exactly thrilled. He made it pretty clear that he's done with me. Said I'm turning my back on the family, the legacy, all of it." Emily's stomach twisted at his words, though she wasn't surprised. She had seen the way Richard operated, the way he saw Ethan as an extension of himself, a tool to maintain power and status. The idea that Ethan could walk away from that would never sit well with a man like Richard. Ethan met her eyes, his expression conflicted. "He'll never accept us, Em. No matter what I do, it's never going to be enough for him. I thought maybe after everything, he'd try to understand, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. Emily leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "Ethan, you can't live your life trying to earn his approval. I know it's hard, but you've made your choice. We've made our choice. And that means we're in this together, no matter what your father thinks." He looked at her, the warmth in her gaze easing the knot of tension that had been building inside him all day. She was right. He had made his decision, and it was the right one, no matter how hard it was to face the fallout. "I know," Ethan said quietly. "It's just, I guess part of me always thought he'd come around, but now I see that's never going to happen." Emily squeezed his hand gently. Maybe not. But that doesn't mean we can't be happy, Ethan. We've built something real here. Something that's ours. You don't need his approval to live your life." Ethan nodded slowly, feeling the weight on his chest begin to lift, even if just a little. "You're right," he said, his voice steadier now. "This is our life, and that's what matters." They sat there for a moment in silence, the hum of the stove and the soft crackle of the soup bubbling the only sounds in the room. Emily reached up to brush a strand of hair behind her ear, her mind racing with thoughts of their future. But before she could say anything, a small cry came from the next room. Ethan froze, and for a second, everything seemed to stop. Emily's eyes met his, and the unspoken truth they had been avoiding for so long finally came to the surface. "I should go check on him," Emily said softly, standing up from the table and moving toward the small bedroom down the hall. Ethan watched her go, his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with fear or anger. It was something much deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel fully until now. Emily returned a few moments later, cradling a small bundle in her arms. The baby's soft whimpering quieted as she gently rocked him, her voice low and soothing. Ethan stood up, walking over to her, his eyes locked on the child. The sight of Emily holding their son hit Ethan like a wave. It wasn't just the enormity of the moment. It was the realization that this was his family now. This was what mattered, not the Parker name, not the legacy his father had tried to chain him to. He reached out, gently running his finger along the baby's tiny hand, feeling the delicate warmth of new life. "He's perfect," Ethan whispered, his voice full of awe. Emily smiled down at their son, her eyes soft with love. "He is." For the first time since Richard's visit, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. His father's disapproval, the life he had left behind, it all faded into the background. This was his life now, and it was more than enough. "I don't care what happens," Ethan said quietly, his eyes never leaving his son. "We're going to be okay. All of us." Emily looked up at him, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. "We will. We're a family, Ethan. That's what matters." Ethan leaned down, kissing her forehead softly. In that moment, standing in their small home with Emily and their child, he knew that nothing his father could do would ever take this away from him. Days passed after Richard's visit, and while the initial shock of his father's arrival had faded, the undercurrent of tension lingered. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Richard wasn't done with them yet, but for the sake of his family, he did his best to push those thoughts aside. He focused on his work at the garage, while Emily spent her days at the bakery, and together, they cared for their son in the evenings, finding comfort in the small routines of their new life. But something had shifted between them. Ethan sensed it, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Emily had been quieter lately, more introspective. At first, he thought it was because of Richard's sudden appearance, but as time went on, he began to suspect that there was something else, something she wasn't telling him. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, their son asleep in the crib nearby, Ethan couldn't ignore the growing distance any longer. Emily had been unusually quiet all evening, her thoughts clearly elsewhere, and he couldn't take it anymore. "Emily," he began softly, turning toward her. "What's going on? You've been distant these past few days. Is it because of my father?" Emily didn't look at him right away. She stared down at her hands, twisting her fingers together in her lap. The silence between them stretched, and Ethan felt his chest tighten. Whatever this was, it was big. He could feel it. "Emily," he said again, his voice gentler now, but edged with concern. "Talk to me." Finally, she lifted her eyes to meet his, and what he saw there made his stomach drop. There was fear in her gaze, fear in something else, something that looked like guilt. "I've been keeping something from you," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan felt his heart start to race. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "There's something I never told you about my past, about why I was working for your family in the first place." Ethan's mind raced. What could she possibly be hiding? Emily had always been so open, so honest. The idea that she had been keeping something from him all this time felt like a betrayal he hadn't seen coming. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight. Emily swallowed hard, her gaze falling back to her hands. "My father. His name was John Davis." Ethan froze, the name hitting him like a punch to the gut. He knew that name. Everyone in the Parker family knew that name. John Davis had once been Richard Parker's business partner, a man who had been close to the Parker empire until a deal had gone disastrously wrong years ago. Ethan had been young at the time, but he remembered the whispers about John Davis's fall from grace, the way his family had been ruined after Richard had severed ties with him. Ethan's mouth went dry. "John Davis was your father?" Emily nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks now. "He was. My family lost everything because of what your father did. I was just a little girl when it happened, but I remember how it changed everything. We were left with nothing." Ethan's mind was spinning, struggling to process what she was saying. The pieces started falling into place, but it still didn't make sense. "But why didn't you tell me this before? Why were you working in our house?" Emily wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her voice trembling. "I didn't plan it, Ethan. I never wanted it to happen this way. But when I needed a job to support my family, I saw the listing for a position at your mansion. I didn't think anyone would remember who I was, so I took it. At first, I just needed the money, but..." She hesitated, her eyes meeting his again, filled with a raw vulnerability. "When I met you, everything changed. I never wanted to hurt you, and I swear I didn't go to your family for revenge. But I knew, deep down, I always knew, that if your father found out who I was, it would tear us apart." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of anger, hurt, and confusion swirling inside him. He stood up, running a hand through his hair as he paced the room. "So this whole time, you've been hiding this from me. You're the daughter of the man my father destroyed, and you didn't think I needed to know." Emily stood too, her voice shaking. "I wanted to tell you, Ethan. I did. But then we got closer, and things between us got real, and I was scared. I was scared you'd look at me differently, that it would ruin everything." Ethan stopped pacing, his hands on his hips as he tried to collect his thoughts. His mind was spinning, but one thing became clear through the haze. The woman he loved had kept a secret from him, one that cut straight to the core of who they were. "I need to think," he said, his voice low but firm. "I need to process this." Emily's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she nodded. "I understand." Without another word, Ethan grabbed his jacket and walked out the door, the cold night air hitting him like a slap in the face. His thoughts raced as he walked through the quiet streets of Burlington, his mind unable to stop replaying everything he'd just learned. The love of his life had been keeping a secret that connected them in ways he never imagined, and now, he didn't know what to do. Ethan walked through the darkened streets of Burlington, the cold air biting at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed with a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, spinning out of control as he replayed Emily's confession over and over again. John Davis. The name echoed in his head like a haunting refrain. He remembered the way his father had spoken about Davis all those years ago, angry, dismissive, as if the man had been nothing more than a nuisance. And now, to find out that the woman he loved, the mother of his child, was Davis's daughter. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. How could Emily have kept this from him? How could she have carried such a heavy secret all this time, knowing who his father was and what he had done? Ethan had always trusted Emily, believed in her completely. but now he felt like he didn't know her at all. He turned down a quiet street, his thoughts churning. Had everything between them been a lie? Was their love real? Or had she always been hiding this agenda, this connection to his family's past? Ethan stopped walking, the weight of it all crashing down on him. He leaned against a lamppost, staring out into the empty street, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find an answer. Emily had said she wasn't there for revenge, but how could he believe that now? How could he trust that this wasn't some long game, a way to get back at his father for everything he'd done to her family? The night stretched on as Ethan wandered aimlessly, lost in his thoughts. He couldn't go home, not yet. He needed time to figure out what this all meant and whether he could ever look at Emily the same way again. He didn't want to lose her. He didn't want to lose the life they had built together. But how could they move forward with this enormous secret between them? Eventually, Ethan found himself at the edge of a small park, the soft rustling of trees offering a brief moment of calm in the chaos of his mind. He sat down on a bench, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together as he stared at the ground. He thought about their life in Burlington, about the quiet moments they had shared, the love they had built far away from the power and privilege of the Parker name. It had been so real, so genuine. At least, that's what he had believed. Now, though, everything felt tainted. What if she had never told him? What if they had gone on living their lives, raising their son, with him never knowing the truth? Ethan clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. He had always known that his father's influence would somehow find a way to seep into this new life. But he hadn't expected it to come through Emily. She had been his escape, his safe place. Now, she was tied to the very thing he had been trying to run from. But even as he wrestled with his anger and betrayal, there was another emotion creeping in. Something quieter, more painful. Love. He still loved her. Despite everything, despite the lies and the secrets, Ethan couldn't deny the truth that had always been there. Emily had become his world, and their son had cemented a bond that went deeper than anything his father had ever controlled. Ethan leaned back on the bench, staring up at the night sky. He couldn't imagine a future without her, without their son. The thought of leaving them, of walking away because of this revelation, made his heart ache in a way he hadn't expected. He had fought so hard to build this life, and now it was all hanging by a thread because of a decision she had made long before they ever met. But could he forgive her? Could he move past the lies, the connection to his father's past, and still see her as the woman he loved, the mother of his child? The question gnawed at him, refusing to let go. After what felt like hours, Ethan finally stood up from the bench, the cold air making him shiver. He had spent the entire night trying to untangle his emotions, but there were no easy answers. The only thing he knew for sure was that he needed to talk to Emily. Running away wouldn't solve anything, and the longer he stayed out here, the more time he gave his doubts to fester. With a heavy sigh, Ethan started walking back toward their house, his steps slow and deliberate. He wasn't sure what he would say when he saw her, wasn't sure if he could forgive her just yet, but he knew they needed to have this conversation. They couldn't move forward without confronting the truth head-on. By the time Ethan reached the front door, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. He stood outside for a moment, staring at the door, knowing that whatever happened next would determine the future of everything they had built together. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped inside. The house was quiet, the soft sounds of his son's breathing coming from the bedroom. Emily was sitting on the couch, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She looked up the moment she heard him enter, her expression filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. He stood there for a moment, staring at her, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "We need to talk." Emily looked up at Ethan from the couch, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been waiting all night, dreading this moment, but knowing it was inevitable. Ethan's face was unreadable, his emotions carefully guarded. He stood by the door, his presence filling the small room with a heaviness that made it hard for her to breathe. They had built a life together, a life full of love and hope, but now it felt like it was hanging by a thread. And she knew it was because of her, because of the secret she had kept for so long. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice shaking as she stood up slowly. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you sooner." Ethan's eyes softened for a brief moment, but then he looked away, his hands resting on his hips as he let out a slow breath. "Why didn't you? Why didn't you tell me who your father was?" Emily swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his question. She had asked herself the same thing countless times, but the answer was never simple. "At first, I didn't think it mattered," she admitted. "I needed a job. My family was struggling, and I just wanted to help. When I saw the position at your house, I didn't think anyone would remember me, or my father. I thought I could just slip in unnoticed." Ethan shook his head, his jaw tight. "But once we got closer, once things between us became real, you still didn't say anything. Why?" Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she stepped closer to him, her hands trembling at her sides. "I was afraid, Ethan. I was afraid that if I told you, it would change everything. That you'd see me differently. Or that you'd think I was just using you to get back at your father. But that's not true. I swear, it's not." Ethan's expression softened, but the hurt in his eyes remained. "I don't know what to believe, Emily. This is huge. Our families. My father destroyed yours. That's not something we can just ignore." "I know," Emily whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "But I never wanted revenge. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to be with you." The silence between them stretched, heavy and painful. Ethan turned away, pacing the room, his mind clearly racing. Emily watched him, her heart breaking as she realized how much she had hurt him. She had always known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to feel like this, like everything was slipping through her fingers. "I don't know if I can just forget this," Ethan finally said, his voice low. "I don't know if I can move past it." Emily felt a sob rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down, forcing herself to stay strong. She had made a choice to keep the truth from him, and now she had to face the consequences. "I understand if you can't forgive me," she said quietly. "I'll accept whatever you decide. But I need you to know that I love you, Ethan. I love you more than anything, and whatever happens, that hasn't changed." Ethan stopped pacing, his back to her, his shoulders tense. For a long moment, he didn't move, and Emily could feel her heart breaking in slow motion. She had kept the secret to protect him, but in the end, it had only caused more pain. "I don't want to lose you," Emily continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I understand if this is too much." Ethan turned around slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was so much conflict in his expression, so much doubt, but beneath it all, there was love. Emily could see it in the way he looked at her, even now, after everything. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "Emily, this isn't just about us. This is about everything. Our families, our pasts, the lies. I don't know how we're supposed to move forward with all of that between us." Emily's heart clenched. She had always feared this moment, feared that the truth would be too much for him to handle. But now that they were here, standing on the edge of losing everything, she knew what she had to do. "I'll walk away," she said softly, her voice trembling. "If that's what it takes, I'll leave so you don't have to carry this weight anymore." Ethan's eyes widened, surprise flashing across his face. "What? No. Emily, that's not what I want." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to hurt you any more than I already have. If me being here, if my connection to the past is going to make things worse, then I'll leave. You and our son deserve better than that." Ethan took a step toward her, his expression torn. "I don't want you to leave, Emily. I don't know how to make this right." Emily wiped her tears, looking up at him with a raw, vulnerable expression. "I don't either, but I know that we can't keep living with this hanging over us. We have to figure out what we really want, and if that means I have to let you go, I will." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words settling between them like a final, painful truth. Ethan's chest tightened, and for the first time that night, he realized just how close he was to losing everything he cared about. But even through the hurt, through the betrayal, one thing stood out above all else. He loved her, and he couldn't imagine a future without her. Ethan closed the distance between them in a single step, pulling Emily into his arms. She gasped softly, but before she could say anything, he whispered, "We'll figure it out. Together." Emily melted into him, her tears soaking into his shirt, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they stood there, holding each other, refusing to let go. The days after their conversation were filled with a cautious sense of peace. Ethan and Emily had taken the first steps toward healing, but they both knew it wouldn't be easy. The truth about her past still hung between them like a shadow, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable obstacle. They had chosen each other, despite everything, and that decision was the foundation they needed to move forward. Ethan spent most of his time at the garage, throwing himself into his work to clear his mind. It wasn't just about fixing cars anymore, it was about rebuilding his life. Each hour spent under the hood, each problem solved, brought him closer to feeling grounded again. He wasn't the man he used to be, and he wasn't the man his father had wanted him to become. He was something else entirely now. And for the first time, that was okay. Emily, too, found solace in her work at the bakery. Though her mind often wandered back to the quiet moments at home, to the conversations they'd had late into the night. She had feared losing Ethan, but now that they had chosen to stay together, she realized just how strong their bond had become. The weight of her secret had been lifted, but she still felt the gravity of what it had done to them. One evening, as they sat together on the small porch of their rented house, watching the sunset over the rolling hills of Burlington, Ethan finally spoke about something that had been on his mind for days. "You know we're going to have to face him again, right?" Ethan said quietly, his gaze focused on the horizon. Emily nodded, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea to keep warm in the cool evening air. "Your father?" "Yeah," Ethan replied, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "He's not just going to let this go. After what happened when he came here, he'll come back." Emily sighed, knowing he was right. Richard Parker wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat easily. He would want to regain control, to pull Ethan back into the life he had planned for him. And the fact that Emily was connected to his past, through her father, John Davis, only complicated things further. "What do you want to do?" Emily asked softly, turning to look at him. Ethan was quiet for a moment, thinking about all the ways his father had tried to control him over the years. But now, something had shifted inside him. He wasn't afraid of Richard anymore. He wasn't that scared kid trying to live up to impossible expectations. He was a man, a father, and he had his own life now. "I think it's time we confront him," Ethan said finally, his voice firm. "Together. He needs to understand that we're not going back. This is our life now, and he has no say in it." Emily stared at him, her heart swelling with both pride and fear. It wouldn't be easy. Richard was a man who didn't take no for an answer, and the idea of standing up to him, of facing the full force of his power, was terrifying. But she knew Ethan was right. They couldn't keep running. "If we do this, Emily said, her voice steady. "We do it together. I won't let him come between us." Ethan reached over, taking her hand in his. "We do it together," he echoed, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. The next morning, Ethan made the call. His father answered almost immediately, his voice sharp and cold on the other end of the line. "Ethan," Richard said, his tone clipped, "I assume you've come to your senses?" "No," Ethan replied, his voice calm. "I haven't, but I need you to come back to Burlington. There's something we need to talk about, face to face." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the silence heavy with tension. Ethan could almost hear the gears turning in Richard's mind, calculating the meaning behind his son's words. "I'll be there," Richard finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I hope, for your sake, that this conversation goes the way I expect it to." Ethan hung up, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The decision was made. Now, all they had to do was face whatever came next. A few days later, Richard Parker arrived in Burlington once again, his sleek black car pulling up to the modest house Ethan and Emily now called home. The contrast between the man in the expensive suit and the humble surroundings couldn't have been starker. Ethan stood on the porch, waiting for him, while Emily stayed inside with their son. Richard stepped out of the car, his eyes cold as he looked at his son. "You've dragged me all the way here again," Richard said, his voice hard. "What is it this time, Ethan?" Ethan didn't flinch. He had been preparing for this moment. "I asked you to come because I need you to understand something," he said, standing tall. "This is my life now. I've made my choice, and nothing you say or do is going to change that." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You're really going to throw everything away for her? For a woman whose family—" Ethan cut him off, his voice stronger than ever before. "Yes, I am. And it's not throwing anything away. It's choosing what matters." Richard stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't feel small under his father's gaze. He didn't feel intimidated or weak. He felt free. "You've made a mistake," Richard said finally, his voice tight with anger. "But it's your mistake to live with." Ethan nodded. "Yes, it is." Without another word, Richard turned and got back into his car, slamming the door behind him. The engine roared to life, and moments later, he was gone, the sleek black car disappearing down the street. Ethan stood there for a moment, watching the car disappear, a strange sense of peace settling over him. It was over. The fight, the struggle for control, it was all over. He turned and walked back into the house, where Emily was waiting, holding their son in her arms. "It's done," he said softly, closing the door behind him. "We're free." Emily smiled, relief flooding her face. "We're free." They stood there together, their little family complete, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they had chosen each other, and that was all that mattered.